For over 1,000 years, a city stood at the edge of two worlds. Not merely a city, a threshold, a living monument to the idea that civilization could endure. That walls built on the right ground by the right hands could hold back the tide of history indefinitely. Constantinople was that idea made stone. Founded by Emperor Constantine the Great in 330 AD, it rose at the junction of Europe and Asia, where the Bosphorus narrows and the sea becomes a corridor. For 11 centuries, it served as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the continuation of Rome itself, long after Rome had fallen to rubble and memory, while Western Europe fractured into feudal kingdoms and forgot the roads the legions had built. Constantinople preserved Roman law, Greek philosophy, Christian theology, and the institutional memory of an empire. Its walls were not just defensive structures, they were a statement. The triple Theodosian Walls, completed in the 5th century, stood nearly 12 meters high, with towers rising above them, a moat before them, and layers of fortification behind them. No enemy had ever breached them. Persians, Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and Crusaders had all arrived at those walls and turned back. Some through military defeat, some through disease, some through sheer exhaustion in the face of stone that refused to yield. The city was more than its defenses. The Hagia Sophia, built in 537 under Justinian, rose above the skyline as one of the largest enclosed spaces on Earth. Its dome appearing to float on rings of light, its mosaics catching the flicker of 10,000 lamps. The markets of Constantinople drew merchants from Venice, Genoa, Persia, and Egypt. Its libraries held manuscripts that the rest of the world had already lost. But that was its height. And by the 15th century, Constantinople was no longer living in its height. It was living in its memory. Inside the walls, the city had changed in ways that maps could not fully capture. The population had collapsed. Where once 500,000 people had filled the streets, with commerce and noise and civic life, fewer than 50,000 now remained, scattered across a city built for 10 times that number. Entire neighborhoods had been abandoned. Fields and orchards had grown up within the city walls, where neighborhoods once stood. The treasury was depleted. The great trade networks that had once made Constantinople wealthy beyond measure had been systematically eroded. First by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Western Christian armies had sacked the city itself, carrying off its gold and relics, and breaking something that could never fully be repaired. Trade concessions had been surrendered to Venetian and Genoese merchants, who now controlled much of the commerce that passed through the city's ports. The empire that had once taxed the trade of the known world was watching others grow rich at its gateway. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire consisted, in practical terms, of Constantinople itself and a handful of territories in Greece. It was no longer an empire in any functional sense. It was a city with an imperial title, beautiful, exhausted, and surrounded. The people inside those walls could see the horizon, and on the horizon something was moving toward them. For decades, the Ottoman state had been consolidating its power across Anatolia and into the Balkans, with a discipline and strategic patience that distinguished it from the tribal confederacies that had preceded it. By the mid-15th century, they controlled vast stretches of territory on both sides of the Bosphorus, surrounding Constantinople almost entirely, leaving it connected to the rest of the Christian world only by sea. Previous Ottoman sultans had besieged Constantinople. None had succeeded. The walls, the Byzantine defensive skill, occasional Venetian naval support, always eventually forced a withdrawal. But in 1451, a new sultan came to power. He was 21 years old. His name was Mehmed, and from the first moments of his reign, those who watched him understood that something was different. Mehmed II was not simply ambitious. He had studied Constantinople. He had read accounts of previous sieges. He spoke multiple languages, including Greek. He understood that Constantinople was not merely a military objective. It was a symbolic one. Whoever held Constantinople held the title of heir to Rome. He had also identified the precise nature of the problem. The walls were the obstacle, and walls, Mehmed understood, were only as strong as the technology used against them. He was thinking about something that had never been deployed at this scale before. He was thinking about cannon. The history of gunpowder artillery in the 15th century was still young. Cannons existed, but their size and reliability remained limited. They were useful but not yet decisive. Mehmed intended to change that. He found his instrument in an engineer named Orban, a Hungarian cannon founder who had first offered his services to Constantine the himself. Constantinople, short of funds, had been unable to pay what Orban asked. Mehmed could. And so Orban arrived in the Ottoman court. The gun Orban eventually produced was reported to be approximately 8 meters long, capable of firing stone balls weighing over 500 kilograms. When the barrel was finally cast and tested, the sound was heard at a distance of 20 kilometers. It was not just one cannon. Mehmed commissioned a battery of artillery. Large guns, medium guns, smaller guns working in coordination. The Theodosian Walls had been built to withstand the military technology of the 5th century. They had never been tested against this. The Ottoman army that assembled outside Constantinople numbered somewhere between 60 and 80,000 men. The Byzantine defenders could field perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 soldiers. Among them, a small contingent of Genoese troops under the command of Giovanni Giustiniani, a skilled mercenary commander who had come with his own men and his own sense of where history was pointing. What did not come, what had been hoped for, prayed for, negotiated for, was substantial European assistance. The theological rupture between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, formalized in the Great Schism of 1054, had never healed. The two branches of Christianity had drifted into mutual suspicion and occasional open hostility. Byzantine emperors had attempted to negotiate a union of the churches in exchange for military support from the West. An agreement had been formally signed in Florence in 1439, but it satisfied no one. A few ships came from Venice. A small number of volunteers arrived, but the great military mobilization that Constantinople needed did not materialize. The city would face what was coming largely on its own. Constantine the Palaiologos understood this. He was the last emperor of the Eastern Romans. By all accounts, Constantine knew what the outcome was likely to be. He had sent for help, he had negotiated, he had prayed, and when none of it changed the equation, he made a decision. He chose to remain. He could have left. Ships were available. He could have retreated and survived. He made the opposite calculation. He would stay, he would fight, and if the walls fell, he would fall with them. The Ottoman siege of Constantinople began in early April 1453. The cannon opened on the walls on April 6th. The sound that followed, repeated, rhythmic, enormous, was unlike anything the defenders had experienced. The great guns of Orban fired projectiles, heavy enough to collapse entire sections of masonry. The defenders adapted with desperate ingenuity. At night, while the Ottoman army rested, Byzantine and Genoese workers labored to fill the breaches with earth, timber, rubble, anything that could absorb the next day's bombardment. They hung bales of wool and leather over the most vulnerable sections to cushion the impact of incoming rounds. What fell during the day was rebuilt imperfectly through the night. It was not sustainable, but it bought time. And time the defenders hoped might bring relief from the sea. Constantinople's position on the Bosphorus meant that it could be supplied by water even when surrounded by land. The Golden Horn was protected by an enormous iron chain, stretched across its mouth, preventing enemy ships from entering. For a brief moment, it seemed that control of the water might compensate for the growing pressure on the walls. Then Mehmed made a decision that altered the entire strategic equation. He ordered his ships moved overland. Ottoman engineers constructed a road of greased wooden rails across the hills north of the Golden Horn. Over a single night, April 22nd, somewhere between 70 and 80 Ottoman ships were hauled out of the water on rollers, dragged across the ridge, and relaunched into the Golden Horn. By morning, the defenders awoke to find an Ottoman fleet. Inside the harbor, they had believed protected. The psychological impact was immediate. The defenders now had to spread their limited forces across additional sections of wall. Every soldier defending a new threat was a soldier, no longer defending the land walls. The Ottoman pressure, already enormous, had just become suffocating. Through May, the pattern continued. Bombardment by day, frantic repair by night, naval harassment from multiple directions, and a steady wearing down of men who had no reserves and no rotation. Inside the city, civilians had largely retreated to churches. The Hagia Sophia was crowded with people praying for a miracle that the political and military situation had made nearly impossible. What remained of the Byzantine leadership knew the situation was deteriorating beyond any realistic possibility of reversal. There was no relief fleet on the horizon. The Ottoman army was not exhausted. It was organized, well supplied, and led by a commander who had planned this moment for years. Mehmed set the date for the final assault, May 29, 1453. The night of May 28th was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Constantine X is reported to have visited the Hagia Sophia for a final time, attending a service that drew together Orthodox and Catholic clergy. He then rode through the city, reportedly saying farewell to those he encountered in the streets and the palaces, understanding that this was a final circuit. Before the assault began, he removed his imperial insignia, the purple robes, the symbols of Roman imperial authority. Stretching back 11 centuries, he set them aside. He would fight as a soldier, not as an emperor seeking to preserve his person by any distinction from the men alongside him, but as one of them, standing in the breach with a sword. It was not a gesture of despair. It was a gesture of clarity. He knew what was coming, and he had decided how he would meet it. The assault began before dawn on May 29th. The first waves struck the walls and were repelled, the defenders exhausted as they were held. Then, in the section of wall near the gate of St. Romanus, something went wrong. A smaller gate, the Kirkeporta, had been left unlocked in the confusion of the night. Ottoman troops found it. Almost simultaneously, Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, whose tactical skill and personal courage had been central to the defense, was struck by a projectile and severely wounded. He withdrew from the walls. His departure broke something in the psychological coherence of the defense. Word spread that Giustiniani had left. The soldiers around him saw the space he had occupied suddenly empty. In a defense this thin, the loss of one critical commander at one critical moment could cascade. It cascaded. Ottoman forces found the breach near St. Romanus and poured through it. The defenders, fighting hand-to-hand, were overwhelmed by numbers. The line, held for weeks, finally broke. Constantine X charged into the fighting. He was last seen in the vicinity of the gate of St. Romanus, sword in hand, fighting among his soldiers. He was never seen again. His body was never conclusively identified. The last Roman emperor disappeared into the violence of the morning that ended his world. By sunrise, the Ottoman banner was flying over the walls of Constantinople. Mehmed II entered the city on horseback on the afternoon of May 29th. He rode to the Hagia Sophia. He dismounted. He gave orders. The Hagia Sophia would be converted into a mosque. The act was not merely religious. It was architectural and symbolic. The building that had been built to say one thing about the nature of power was being repurposed to say something else. Mehmed would later style himself Kaiseri Rum, Caesar of Rome. He understood the symbolic stakes precisely. He was not simply conquering a city, he was claiming a legacy. Istanbul, as Constantinople would henceforth be called, became the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. Mehmed encouraged resettlement, invited craftsmen and merchants back, and set about transforming the city. Within decades, it would be one of the largest cities in the world again, rebuilt under a different banner, but rebuilt. For the Christian kingdoms of Europe, the fall of Constantinople carried a weight that transcended the military. The city had existed in the European imagination as a kind of eternal fact. The Ottoman control of Constantinople and of the Bosphorus introduced new tolls, new political calculations, and a new set of intermediaries between Western European merchants and the goods they wanted from the East. The pressure to find alternative routes intensified. Within 40 years, a Portuguese navigator would round the southern tip of Africa. Within 50 years, a Genoese navigator, sailing under Spanish sponsorship, would cross the Atlantic. The age of global maritime exploration did not begin in 1453. But 1453 tightened the conditions that made it inevitable. Something else left Constantinople in those final months. The scholars left. Byzantine intellectual culture had preserved and copied texts from the ancient world that had been lost or forgotten. In Western Europe for centuries, the Byzantine scholars who fled carried manuscripts with them. They arrived in Venice, Florence, Rome, where they found audiences already developing an intense interest in classical antiquity. The influx of Byzantine scholars and manuscripts after the fall accelerated the recovery of classical texts, deepened the engagement with Greek philosophy, and contributed to the intellectual environment in which the Renaissance would reach its peak. Ideas crossed frontiers when empires closed doors. The fall of one world fertilized another. The Ottoman Empire that now stretched across Anatolia, the Balkans, and into southeastern Europe was a sophisticated multinational imperial structure that administered diverse religious and ethnic communities. The millet system granted considerable internal autonomy to Christian and Jewish populations in exchange for loyalty and tax revenue. The Ottoman Empire at its height would control territory, from Morocco to Mesopotamia, from the gates of Vienna to the coast of Yemen. The consolidation of that empire began on the morning of May 29, 1453. For Europe, the military lessons of Constantinople took time to absorb. The Theodosian Walls, 12 centuries of impregnable stone, had been breached by artillery in a matter of weeks. This was a demonstration that the entire architectural logic of medieval fortification was obsolete. The high, thin walls that had defined European military architecture for centuries were catastrophically vulnerable to cannon fire. The response was the Trace Italienne, a new form of fortification built low-wide, and with angled bastions designed to deflect cannonballs and eliminate blind spots. Fortresses were rebuilt, siege doctrine was revised. The relationship between offense and defense in land warfare shifted in ways that would define European military conflict for the next 2 centuries. Gunpowder had proven that stone could fall. The world adapted, but the adaptation required acknowledging that what had once seemed permanent was not. Empires do not disappear in a single day. They contract slowly year by year, territory by territory, resource by resource, until what remains is a skeleton of what they were. Constantinople did not fall on May 29, 1453. It had been falling for 2 centuries. What happened on that morning was the final punctuation of a sentence written across generations. The moment when the last emperor removed his imperial robes, the last walls were breached, and the long process of decline became finally irreversible. What changed on that day was not just the fate of a city. It was the end of a continuity, a thread of institutional, cultural, and symbolic connection stretching back to the Rome of Augustus and Constantine, through 1,000 years of survival to one last morning of resistance. The medieval world did not end because of one siege, but the fall of Constantinople was the clearest signal that it was ending. Every system that endures long enough comes to believe in its own permanence. The Theodosian Walls had stood for 1,000 years. The dynasty had survived every assault that history had thrown at it. The city had outlasted everything that had come before. And then it didn't. I am Victor. What seemed unbreakable was not unbreakable. It was simply untested by the right force, at the right moment. History does not grant permanence. It grants duration. And duration, however long, is not the same thing as forever.